Bloomberg Tech is live from coast to coast with Caroline Hyde in New York and Ed Ludlow in San Francisco.
Welcome to a special edition of Bloomberg Tech. Tim Cook is stepping down as CEO of Apple on September 1st. After 15 years leading the company, he will become executive chairman.
Taking over as CEO, John Ternus. He's been Apple's head of hardware engineering since 2021. He's spent 25 years at the company, focused on product development.
Over the next hour, we'll break down Cook's legacy, Apple's performance, and what will change under new leadership, all things that investors are trying to price in. We'll also look at Cook's next role, working with policymakers, and get reaction from markets, analysts, and our team of reporters.
And joining us first is Bloomberg senior tech editor Dana Wollman in New York, who helps lead our consumer tech coverage, which of course reported earlier this year that Ternus was the heir apparent. Mark Gurman has an extraordinary way of foreseeing Apple's future, as always. But who is John Ternus?
So he really has spent most of his professional career at Apple. He joined just 4 years after graduating college. So he really has grown up there professionally. He came there as a recent mechanical engineering grad. And as you said, really has that background on the product side. So he really is a hardware guy. And as we've reported here at Bloomberg, more recently has been consolidating power and responsibility on the hardware side, presumably in preparation for this CEO transition.
Overnight, Bloomberg published the full memos that Tim Cook and John Ternus shared with Apple staff. And I'm just pointing that out to our audience because right now there's basically a company-wide all hands going on. So we're on the watch for any news that comes out of that. What else are we learning? The read on this from our reporting and the comments from Tim Cook is that he has a new role, but he's not really going anywhere. What are we expecting him to do?
So he's going to be transitioning to an executive chairman role and really focusing on diplomacy, both at a corporate level and almost geopolitical level, just given where Apple sits at the intersection of U.S. policy and U.S. relations with countries like China. So according to our reporting, at least, as much as John Ternus was ready to assume the role of CEO, wasn't quite ready to take on this more geopolitical role of negotiating on behalf of the company in a really high stakes way.
That is the core of the story and what you need to know about Apple. Bloomberg's Dana Wollman, who leads consumer tech. Thank you. Let's get more on Wall Street's take, on the industry's take, with Ben Badirin, Creative Strategy CEO and Principal Analyst. His coverage includes consumer technology, personal computing, devices, semiconductors, and with respect, Ben, you've been at this for a very long time. Pretty much the same amount of time that John Ternus has been at Apple. He is a hardware guy. He's an engineering guy. How do you see this changing Apple going forward?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of excitement just coming from, a now hardware, maybe more engineering-centric CEO. It's obviously been a while, right, since that's happened for someone who I think both the company and then the outsiders believe would have a more distinct point of view on the hardware side of things. I think there's also just the cultural dynamic, right? Working for an engineer, having a CEO who can speak your language, who can be in that room on product development, maybe work through some of the real hard engineering challenges for Apple's roadmap. And then more importantly, I think, the next phase of Apple's growth is still going to be very hardware centric with existing categories, getting more aggressive as they launch more products per family, as well as a whole slew of new hardware categories. So I think there's a lot of optimism there. We've heard he's well liked. I know, Mark Gurman and you guys have said the same thing. So I think there's a lot of positivity, and I think the street will respond well. I think the market will like him, and then obviously with Tim Cook not going away, there's the calming presence there that maybe Tim Cook can still do some of the geopolitical stuff that needs to happen, and let John just continue to focus on execution at Apple.
Ben, how surprised were you either by the timing or that it happened at all?
No, not surprised. In fact, Mark Gurman and I have been talking about this for probably 2 years. I think the reality is that we had felt that Tim Cook would want to get past the 50th anniversary, which is what he did. Obviously, you now have a couple more quarters where Tim Cook will still be on earnings calls to help ease that transition, and I would expect John Ternus to be involved as well. We had felt that it would be this year, but really because I feel like the market just wanted to know, like the industry as well, just wanted to know who's going to lead Apple for the next 10 to 15 years. And I think that there was angst around that. And it's good that they did this post 50th. And now we know who will be at the helm. And I think, again, it's a good decision.
All of this, does it signal confidence that the AI strategy is coming? That the right building blocks are in place for WWDC for September the 1st to be off into the races for John Ternus?
I think so. And I think that's a great point just in terms of, if it wasn't, if there was any hiccups or could we be worried about a delay, is there lack of confidence in what they're doing, this would not be the right time. So I do think that there's a lot of things are in place. Tim Cook is happy with the direction that the company is in. I think he's happy again with the stewardship of the culture of Apple that he was then tasked with after Steve Jobs died. And now John Ternus will be responsible for carrying that culture forward as well. So I think, there was a lot of intention, I don't expect Tim Cook would have done any of this in haste or by any sort of pressure. I think he just felt it was the right time. Apple's in good hands and in a good position in terms of all of their strategies. And now it's a time for John to drive the next leg of growth for Apple.
An engineering brain is how Tim Cook described John Ternus, but with an innovator's heart. So talk about the innovation that you started to see, and we understand how much adoption of AI that John has brought to his own team internally, but he's also working on the hardware as well to bring us the future of AI within Apple.
Yeah, I think the innovation side, even the invention side, where you've got somebody who can be in, again, that room, who can be a fast adopter, who can push the limits of technology, and who can have high expectations and high demands of the engineers, which was really one of the things that, when Steve Jobs was there, he was constantly challenging people, making them be better. And he came at it from a what was possible, what was possible with product and with technology. So I think, John Ternus is going to have that. He's obviously, as you pointed out, been at Apple a really long time. And, more importantly, been involved in some of the biggest product launches that Apple has had. So I think he's well suited for this. There's obviously a lot of very key decisions that he'll have to make. And I think people will want to see how he handles that, things relative to their AI software strategy, as good as their hardware strategy is, just knowing where they're going to land in software, partners that they'll make there. So it'll be, interesting to see and evaluate that. But like I said, I think coming from the engineering side, when Apple's going to just need to be in a hardware growth cycle for the foreseeable future, is a good spot. And I think he'll bring a lot of expertise to that, to those conversations.
And Maharan of Creative Strategies, great analysis that maybe the market still wants to wrap its head around. Let's look at the market reaction, because Apple is lower today. In fact, it's the biggest points drag on the NASDAQ 100. We're off by 2.5%. Now, we're seeing, therefore $98 billion wiped off the market capitalization of this company. Still, it's worth 3.9 trillion, Ed. But there is some questioning.
Yeah, it took time to get to this decline for the market to make itself up when the major indices are flat, basically, a lot amidst many headlines.
Coming up, Tim Cook may be stepping down as CEO, but his skills in corporate diplomacy will still be at the hand for Apple. More on that next. This is Bloomberg Tech. Welcome back to a special edition of Bloomberg Tech. We check in on Apple because it is the biggest points drag today. We're seeing its worst performance, in a couple of months, February the 27th. New leadership, a CEO transition, Tim Cook to John Ternus. Tim Cook added 2,000% or thereabouts to the stock market valuation of this company over his 15-year tenure, Ed.
One of Tim Cook's challenges has been managing Apple's relationship with the White House. The outgoing Apple CEO has navigated global tariffs and supply chain disruptions, while on the whole, staying in President Trump's good graces over the course of 2 administrations. That was evident in today's post from the president describing Cook's, quote, amazing career and calling him, quote, an incredible guy. Let's get more on the Cook-Trump dynamic with Bloomberg's senior tech editor out of Washington, Mike Shepard. This was a focus for Cook, and it will continue to be, Shep. What do we need to know?
It certainly will be. And, when we talk about the Apple statement pointing to his new job engaging with global policymakers, naturally that means continuing work with officials in China to ensure that their presence there is unfettered and that they can continue to produce there, and that their expansion into India to bolster the supply chain there for the company is proceeding apace as well. But there is no other relationship more important right now than the one with President Donald Trump. And Cook was really a pioneer among the tech industry when it came to engaging with the president. He really built that tie all the way back in 2017, shortly after Trump took office in his first term, and the two began exchanging phone calls and really having this kind of dialogue that the president alluded to in his Truth Social post. And he even talked about how Cook would go to the White House and to him specifically as president, seeking certain things, seeking relief from impositions by the government. And we know that he was able to persuade the first Trump administration to lay off on some tariffs that would have hit iPhones and AirPods and other Apple devices. And more recently, since the president returned to office, we have seen that same level of engagement and really the same payoff for Apple in terms of relief from some of the president's tariffs. And this role will take on continued importance, of course, with lingering tensions between the U.S. and China over trade, and of course now with the geopolitical friction rising, touched off by the war in Iran. And so we're going to have to see how Tim Cook plays this out, how much he is continuing to be a frequent interlocutor with Trump and a frequent visitor here to Washington, too.
Bloomberg's Mike Shepard, as always, wrapping things up in Washington. Thank you. Let's get more on the political global dynamics Tim Cook has navigated and will continue to. Jason Oxman's with us, CEO of the Information Technology Industry Council. It's a tech trade association, a global one, of which Apple is, of course, a member. So, Jason, how important will Tim Cook's senior role, executive chair, remain for the company?
Well, Tim's role and his leadership in the tech industry has been incredible. But as Mike noted, his work on the geopolitical government diplomacy front has been even more impactful. I think Tim Cook really set the stage for the tech industry's engagement with the Trump administration. He developed, as we've been talking about, a personal relationship with the president, but he also helped inform the president's decision-making in a variety of ways. And I think the U.S.-China relationship is really at the center of that. So I'm pleased, and the tech industry is certainly pleased, that Tim Cook will continue to play this role going forward. I think it's important for the administration to understand the business impact of the political and governmental decisions that are made, and that U.S.-China relationship is at the core of that. I also think Apple has been a leader in investing in the United States in manufacturing, hundreds of billions of dollars of investment made there, but also reminding the administration that supply chains are global. So as Apple and the rest of the tech industry continue to invest in manufacturing in the United States, they need access to critical components and need access, of course, to the 95% of the world's population that doesn't live in the United States as customers for American technology. So I think that role has been important and will continue to be important going forward.
It's worth remembering Tim Cook's supply chain prowess. We have seen supply chain changes from China into India, Vietnam for Apple. What's number one, therefore, for Tim Cook to address September the 1st and continue to do so as the role of CEO? Is it more Iran or is it more China?
Well, I think China is at the center for the technology industry of the discussion, because although the relationship between U.S. and China is complicated, to say the least, they are the two largest players in the global supply chain. We're, of course, very much looking forward to President Trump's visit to China. I think the discussions there will be productive. And Apple has definitely demonstrated, as other technology companies have, that manufacturing is global. So as manufacturing happens in the U.S., it happens in China, it happens in India. The rest of Southeast Asia, of course, is a manufacturing hub as well. So I think that geopolitical relationship is enormously important. And early milestones and signs of the warming relationship between the U.S. and China are obviously very positive. Continuing that relationship going forward will be crucial for the tech industry. Look,
Jason,
when you look at supply chains and critical minerals, a lot of things that just aren't available in the United States are available in China, and we need those supply chains globally to remain active.
Let's end the discussion by remembering what happened. The president put pressure on Apple last summer. He wanted them to build the iPhone in the United States, and he talked about tariffs. In August, Apple announced over 4 years a $600 billion commitment. to manufacture more things in the United States. Was that fully resolved, that request from the White House, and how Apple responded to it?
I think Apple's response was enormously positive. We saw the president and senior members of the administration visiting Apple manufacturing facilities. We saw a very positive reaction out of the White House about the moving to the United States of a lot of manufacturing capability. Look, can all manufacturing happen in the United States? No, of course not. We need to continue to advance manufacturing in the United States in parallel with manufacturing happening around the world, in the same way that no American company can succeed only investing in the United States market for customers, because only 5% of the global population lives in the United States. You need access to the rest of the world. So I think it is a balance. I think Apple has done a phenomenal job of investing significantly in the United States in order to be responsive to the administration's goals. And I think the rest of the tech ecosystem is doing the same. The second day of the Trump administration, the very first announcement was about data center investments in the United States, and that's happening apace. But at the same time, I think we need to recognize that the rest of the world economy and the rest of the world supply chains are global, and we need to focus on that as well.
Jason Oxman, CEO of the Information Tech Industry Council, thank you. While Apple navigates a leadership transition, Amazon is doubling down on AI. Amazon, already one of Anthropic's biggest backers, is investing an additional $5 billion in the company, securing a $100 billion cloud commitment in return. The news broke within minutes of the Tim Cook announcement. Bloomberg's Matt Day has more. Last night was chaos. This was a big deal. It moved markets. What do we need to know?
So what we need to know is that there really aren't any questions anymore about how much scale Amazon is going to have in the AI business. You roll the clock back a couple of years, and they were a little bit at sea in this new market. Now they've got $100 billion plus commitments from Anthropic, as well as OpenAI. So it seems they've really kind of found a seat at the table here, empowering these AI models.
How much are we still seeing this circularity, as the market likes to call it? The equity being given to Amazon, but the promise towards AWS, is that just inevitable the way these deals go?
It sure seems to be. So last night's commitment, the details are $5 billion from Amazon to Anthropic now, up to $20 billion sometime in the future, depending on certain commercial arrangements. Then on the other side of that, Anthropic is going to spend somewhere north of $100 billion on Amazon services over 10 years. So a lot of money going back and forth.
And that deal struck at that valuation of $350 billion.
Exactly.
We appreciate you. Bloomberg's Matt Day on all things Anthropic and Amazon. But let's get back to the Apple story. Coming up, John Ternus is set to inherit one of Silicon Valley's biggest gambles, according to our Bloomberg opinion colleagues. Look, with the shares still down off by 2.4%, biggest drop in a month, is it a bet on hardware as its future?
Yeah.
Ed, this is the key question.
We're 3 hours into the session. It's taken investors time to kind of digest this big piece of news, right? And the indexes are flat. What changes? Does anything change? Our reporting says both. He was the continuity candidate, John Ternus, but he'll do it his way, different to Tim Cook.
And how will he wrap his arms around the AI question? That really has been the fly in the ointment of an extraordinary run, 15-year run.
Hardware
that Tim
first.
Cook has done.
John Ternus is a hardware guy, and he's an engineering guy, and he's a product guy. And so we're talking about that being manifested on device. I'm interested to see what happens in the balance in the next few months. Just by the way, on that Amazon story, you get the red headline, Tim Cook stepping down as CEO, and immediately another red headline about Amazon Anthropic. The tech news cycle is wild. We'll be right back. It's halftime. This is Bloomberg Tech.
Welcome back to a special edition of Bloomberg Tech. We check in on the markets, and the Nasdaq 100 doing very little of anything today. We're currently trading flat by about 0.1% lower. Of course, geopolitical headwinds still buttress the entire market. We have the Warsh hearing, and we, of course, have still questions over negotiations between US and Iran. But the key story in technology is one we continue to be fixated upon. Apple is your biggest points drag on the Nasdaq 100 today, having the worst day in a couple of months since end of February, off by 2.6%. This, as we hear of a changing of the guard after 15 years, Tim Cook is handing over the reins come September the 1st, Ed.
Yeah, to John Ternus, a hardware guy, an engineering guy. Apple may be going for continuity in its choice of new CEO, but Tim Cook's left a lasting legacy and impression on the company that he ran for 15 years. Bloomberg's senior executive editor for tech, Tom Giles, is with us, and that's what we've been reflecting on, Tom. You can measure it in a number of ways. One, When Tim Cook became CEO, Apple had a market cap of $350 billion. It's breached the $4 trillion market cap mark. How else would we measure the era that was Tim Cook as CEO of Apple?
So many ways. He oversaw such a massive expansion in terms of their footprint, in terms of where they operate and how deeply they penetrate markets like China, for example, based on a foundation that he really laid in terms of bringing Apple into China and expanding it there in terms of the number of stores, the number of products, and its reach at a time when other U.S. companies, most other U.S. big tech companies, save Tesla, could not make any headway in that country. Massive legacy. Other numbers to think about: 8x increase in profits over his tenure. A massive increase in the number of stores to 540, $3.66 trillion in market cap, as you alluded to earlier. And that's just a testament to the ways that he really made Apple so much more interwoven into our everyday lives, jam-packing the iPhone with more features, and then adding peripheral devices like the watch and like the AirPods, not to mention expansions in things like the Mac and the iPad. It was just a matter of really expanding Apple's reach geographically and deeper into the lives of consumers around the world.
Tom, like more than 2.5 billion active devices, but not many of them are the VR headsets. And certainly none of them ended up being a car. There have been a couple of missteps along the way. Absolutely.
There were things that Apple spent a lot of time and money on. The car, you mentioned, $10 billion over 10 years. They gave it a college try and it never quite came together. The Vision Pro, as you pointed out, has not taken off. And that's one that it will not go down in the annals of his great success stories. But so many other things did take off, like the watch, like the AirPods. My own personal view on the AirPods, I remember the early versions. They looked like earrings. They weren't my cup of tea, but now I am completely hooked on them, left the cords completely behind. That's just one small personal example of the ways that, the expansion and the ways that Tim Cook introduced products that won over even the skeptics like me.
But have your kids, the Gen Zers, left the cords behind? That's the question, Tom Giles. We so appreciate it. We're glad you took one of the AirPods out to join us today. Now, in choosing Ternus as Cook's successor, the iPhone maker is stressing that its future remains in that hardware, like the AirPods. But according to Bloomberg opinion columnist Dave Lee, that means the incoming CEO is inheriting a big gamble. Dave, pleased to say, sits next to us here. Why is it the gamble in this age of AI?
Well, look, when you put Apple alongside the other big tech rivals, Google, Amazon, Meta, their spending on the AI revolution, in Apple's case, is very, very small, magnitude smaller. And, depending on how you look at it, either Tim Cook's been pretty restrained there, quite shrewd, and saying, maybe we don't have to invest so much in that just yet, or Apple's hopelessly behind. And when all these data centers start coming online, Apple's going to be more vulnerable for it, particularly if some of these AI applications get put into phones that aren't the iPhone and other devices that aren't Apple. I see it personally, the promotion of John Ternus, it's Apple saying, look, the thing we do best is hardware. And, I think if you'd have asked analysts 2 years ago whether or not Apple had much AI by now, they'd have said that would have been a disaster. But look, the iPhone's never been stronger. When people use the latest AI tools like vibe coding, they use a MacBook to do it. Mac Minis were running on shortages because people were using that for agentic AI. Apple is still the device of choice, and I think that's what Apple is saying here. They're saying we need to carry on being that company whilst working in some of these new technologies as well.
What the other kind of peripheral piece of your column that's so interesting is you capture the kind of role that that he's played in development. And so you talk about ambient computing. I'm talking John, that is. He's kind of like gone through the development cycle of products that are the new way people interact with software, not necessarily the iPhone. But then you talk about chronology. June, we have WWDC. Tim Cook will still be there. September and into the fall, that's iPhone season. And you are basically billing this as his on stage moment.
Yes.
All around the iPhone. Explain the thesis, I suppose.
Yes, I mean, look, one of the questions about Tim Cook moving on was going to be the timing, right?
Yeah.
If you see Apple as vulnerable in some ways, the timing could have been difficult. By announcing this now and saying that John Ternus will take over in September, his first real public introduction to the wider world, I mean, he's well known in technology circles, but to the wider world is going to be standing on stage saying, here's the new cycle of iPhones. And around that time, we're expecting, if Bloomberg, as Bloomberg's already reported, that there'll be a folding iPhone as well. So John Ternus is going to have this great moment where he can say, the new era of iPhone is here, and I'm the guy in charge that's going to be ushering it in. I think that's very, very important for Apple investors to associate John Ternus with this new era. One of the things that Tim Cook is going to continue to do, which I also think is very important, is that he seems to be retaining this role as the kind of chief diplomat. We saw Donald Trump talking about some of that in his social media posts. It would be quite smart for Apple to separate those two functions. John Ternus is the man, he's running the company, he's fully focused on doing that. Tim Cook can deflect some of that attention and be the man who turns up with Tim Cook in the Oval Office, doing all those things that Apple, I think, would prefer not to be doing at all, frankly.
Oh, Tim Apple. We haven't said that line yet, and you call it John Apple in your piece. And how is it in this uncharted territory of supply chain? And when you think about some of the new innovations that Mark Gurman so well spells out for us that are likely on their line, we've got, maybe a robotic future, maybe at least a video TV that moves around with you, that you're able to do the calls on. This is going to be AI integration. How much is John going to be at the heart of that supply chain change?
Well, that's his entire resume, right? It's in building some of these new products. We know that he's been across every major product line. I think AirPods, as Tom was mentioning just a moment ago, if ambient computing is the new interface, if screens play less of a role in our life, the product that's already in millions of ears around the world is the AirPods. And so, I do think there is this perhaps overstatement of how vulnerable Apple is to AI, because its hardware has just got such an incredible reputation. And whereas Steve Jobs' innovation was perhaps in individual products, particularly the iPhone, Tim Cook's innovation was in building those products and getting as many of them built as quickly and to the incredibly high standard. When you have a company like OpenAI saying, we're going to make an AI device, it's going to be designed by Johnny Ive, doing that in small numbers, sure, that's a doable task. I think making hundreds of millions of them and competing with Apple, I think it's much more difficult to do that than it is for Apple to learn how to add AI to its devices.
Dave Lee, Bloomberg opinion columnist, thank you very much. As Apple enters a new chapter under CEO John Ternus from September 1st, all eyes are focused on what that means for Apple's future hardware cycle. Nabila Popao is Senior Research Director at IDC and joins us now. And you come on this program and we talk about the outlook for handset sales, and we're zeroed in on the iPhone. The only question for you is whether a change in CEO from Tim Cook to John Ternus changed your outlook for how the iPhone and future generations of the iPhone will do this year and beyond.
Thank you for having me. No, that's a great question. And, I would say, and I think as many others, right, that John Ternus is the perfect choice to take Apple into the next era. I mean, like you said yourself, he's a products guy, he's a hardware guy. And, I think it's just taking Apple full circle, right? When Tim Cook took the reins from Steve Jobs, he was taking the reins from a product innovation like legend, right? And everyone questioned that choice, right? That, okay, well, how will Apple survive in, Tim Cook being a supply chain operation guy? And we know what Tim Cook has accomplished. I think we've all discussed in terms of how much he added, growing market capitalization tenfold, growing Apple iPhone ASP by 30% from $700 to $1,000 plus, and tons of other, accomplishments, expanding especially Apple's ecosystem. But he couldn't have done all of that, much more, of course, without really having those reins. You can't become a global company without controlling supply chain operations. So now that all has been accomplished and, kind of in smooth play, it's just coming with John Ternus's appointment. It's bringing Apple back full circle, back to the products guy, right? Who will leverage his engineering and hardware expertise. And he's already had his hands on, being the chief architect or being involved in many of the key products. But taking Apple to the next level, the next big iPhone-like innovative product into the next era. So Nabila, I'm really excited.
We're looking at the image that Apple published of John Ternus with Tim Cook taking a walk on Apple Park campus, Cupertino. What's the environment that this transition takes place in? You give an annual forecast. You talk about the macro factors that are impacting the smartphone market right now. What is it that John Ternus is taking on?
Definitely, he's got big shoes to fill, right? Given everything that Tim Cook has accomplished in his tenure, but he's young, he's at 50, he's got a long, runway ahead of him. And I think the most prominent challenge right now, aside from coming up with that big innovative product, is to navigate Apple through this memory shortage and supply, crisis, which is again, a very kind of up the alley of Tim Cook, right? So that might be the question that, okay, how is John Ternus going to navigate that? And Apple's already proved to investors, to consumers, to anyone in the industry that despite what's already happening, because this is not memory crisis, is something we're in today, and we're forecasting. Apple was one of the few companies in the top 5 to show positive year-on-year growth in Q1, and we expect Apple to be, probably best positioned this year to gain share. But right, you wonder if this change's leadership will impact that stronghold. But and the other concern I had earlier when we were talking about John Ternus as the heir apparent is how will he navigate geopolitics, right? How will he play that balancing act that Tim Cook has done so perfectly over the years, taking Apple through the pandemic or the tariffs crisis, getting so many exceptions for Apple, if not the entire smartphone and consumer devices category, right? So how will he, any other CEO, manage that? So I think they solved that puzzle perfectly with keeping Tim Cook on as executive chairman to still balance that and handle that.
Can I jump in on, give us how much John Ternus has already shown that sophistication when it comes to its own supply chain? It was through his navigation that Apple's so in control of their own chips. He had to make that move, right, and help weave and navigate from Intel to homegrown.
Absolutely, and that not only helped in terms of bringing, excellent products with better performance and efficiency, but also really helped, margins, right? I mean, you were, as a company, having access to your own supply chipset. He has already proven himself, which is why he's won the confidence of the board, which gave him unanimous vote to put him in this new leadership position, and also investors, right? And we've already seen Apple put him in the leadership seat with leading the launch of the MacBook Neo. Which again, I think he had a chief role in, right? Leveraging smartphone chip into that and bringing that into price point that no one ever thought that a premium, premium like MacBook would be available at. They're going to break another few records in that category as well this year.
And he was integral in design of iPad, for example. Nabila, push us forward. 15 years, that's too hard probably. 5 years.
Yeah.
Does market share remain the same for Apple if guided well?
Absolutely. If not, I think Apple is already well positioned to grow. They will see a few points share growth, both in the PC category, thanks to the MacBook Neo, as well as in the smartphone category, because of its continued push in premiumization and really perfect timing. I think the memory crisis is probably it's bad news for everyone, but it just miraculously, again, works out in Apple's favor. So I think 5 years down the line, especially with the new products that are on the table, right? We've talked about the rumors around Apple, the glasses, whatever they're going to be called, and with the iPhone Fold that is coming out as soon as the reins are handed over, and that's going to fall in John's tenure, right? And other products in robotics and tabletop robotics, whatever those products entail. So definitely in the old consumer devices space, Apple is very likely to continue to gain share and be a market leader.
Nabila Popal, it's great to have you from IDC.
Thanks
for your time today. Coming up, John Ternus' appointment as CEO signals that Apple will stay the course on hardware, but and software synergy too. More on that next. This is Bloomberg Tech.
Welcome back to a special edition of Bloomberg Tech. We are near session lows on Apple. Last night, when news broke that Tim Cook would be stepping down as CEO on September 1st, becoming executive chair, and that John Ternus, the hardware chief, would be taking on the CEO role, there was this muted reaction. Apple hardly moved, its suppliers hardly moved. We are 3 hours or more into the session, and with time, investors are digesting this. The stock underperforming. It is down almost 3% while major indices are flat. But people have had time to read Bloomberg's reporting, read the analysis, and make up their mind on what this means, Kara.
Yeah, and meanwhile, we delve more into what it means because Apple's post-Tim Cook era signals a strategic continuity over disruption. Bloomberg intelligence analysts say they expect Apple to focus on its core ecosystem. For a look at the road ahead and the massive shoes Ternus now has to fill, especially in China, BI's Anurag Rana joins us now, who's one of the first out the gate with this take. And Anurag, consistency, what does that mean in terms of Ternus being able to drive the supply chain that in many ways Tim Cook has still navigated and will do as exec chair?
Yeah, I think this has been his legacy, the supply chain. It is really remarkable for a company to maintain margins this high, despite everything that's going on, from tariffs to memory prices, etc. I mean, he's done a phenomenal job. Last night I started to look at returns, and look at them over the from the day he took on till yesterday. Compounded annual growth rate of over 24%, and S&P over that time period is at 15%. So massive outperformance on that end. It's done a phenomenal job of creating an ecosystem. Some will say that services is the future of Apple, but in our view, the services is nowhere unless you have the devices that drives the ecosystem. So from our side, I think this basically says Apple at the heart is a hardware company and will remain one of those.
So let's be more specific about that. You write in your research that Apple could even sharpen its hardware strategy. What do you mean by that? What would that look like to you?
See, one of the biggest complaints that we have heard for almost a decade now is that there is no real innovation in the iPhone, for example. It is still the same. We haven't even seen a foldable device come out at this point compared to Samsung, who's launched it several years ago. So you can anticipate that if your heart is really in hardware, you're going to have a lot more focus in that area. We saw that with Microsoft and Satya. When Satya came on, cloud was at the center of his older job, and that really made the biggest difference. And in fact, that has been the primary growth driver for Microsoft. So we anticipate a lot more work to be done on the hardware side and see what he does with it.
Talk about a foldable phone. We talk about how AI is going to be adopted. In many ways, it's a black eye that they're having to turn to a key rival, to Google, for the underpinnings of Siri. But how do you think John Ternus really thinks about that integration and becoming more self-sufficient in the future?
Yeah, but they turn to Google for search. I mean, why not go to the provider that has the best technology? So right now they think Google Gemini has the best model. They're going to use it in their own models. On top of that, they're going to allow Siri to tap into any AI network that's out there. I think at this point, with models changing so dramatically, you don't want to be, basically bound by one ecosystem, whether that's Anthropic, Gemini, or OpenAI. You do want to have the flexibility for your users to tap into any LLM of what they want. And I think that's what Apple's done. Look at their CapEx. I mean, it's 3% of revenues compared to Microsoft, which is now over 40%.
Bloomberg Intelligence is Anurag Rana with the key React research on the Bloomberg terminal. You should read it. Anurag's been at this a long time. Thank you for joining us on the special show. Coming up, I think Kara and I are going to take a minute and just summarize everything we've learned about Apple's succession plans. Stay with us. This is Bloomberg Tech. What a day, what a story. Apple shares, after a few hours of the world digesting the news that Tim Cook is stepping down as CEO and John Ternus steps in as CEO effective September 1st, the stock is down more significantly, but it took a while. It took a while for the digestion to go on, and really, the optimism is still among the analyst community. We've got 40 buys on this stock, just 2 sells, and many still thinking that this is a continuity play. But there is an element of risk here as we see Tim Cook go up to more of a political role, more of that diplomatic role. We're up by 2.5%. The big headline is that after 15 years, he steps back as CEO. But the other big story is that he has a new role, executive chairman, where he is focused on policymakers. And the president of the United States posting on Truth Social in response to this news is pretty telling, right?
There's a lot of love for this guy. An amazing career, he says. An incredible guy. I mean, there is a lot more to this post. Some of it's what he makes light of the fact that he once called him Tim Apple, of course, which many will forever remember. But here is someone who's managed over 2 administrations of Trump to really navigate what are some really difficult headwinds. He's managed to expand out supply chain, India, Vietnam, but still very dependent on China and still something he has to work upon as exec chair.
And the net result was Apple committing $600 billion to the United States over 4 years. Let's bring up the image of outgoing CEO Tim Cook and incoming CEO John Ternus. The timing was a surprise.
Same but different.
This is what Apple published, by the way, this photo. But it's a surprise because Apple just celebrated 50 years. And in a number of interviews, Tim Cook kind of indicated he wasn't going anywhere. But the fact that John Ternus was heir apparent, not a surprise, as it was detailed in detail by Bloomberg News.
Yeah, a month ago, March 22nd, Mark Gurman puts out the thought leadership piece about how John Ternus is now having his time in the spotlight, introducing new categories of product, and a man who's going to be developing and giving us all to the world a lot more of them to come.
He's a hardware guy, he's an engineering guy, and he's the continuity candidate. And we're still trying to work out what happens in the next era of Apple.
That does it for this special edition of Bloomberg Tech.
Check out the podcast. You know where to find it, online, on the terminal. From New York City, this is Bloomberg Tech.